Well, Creative Mornings, it's a bit of an oxymoron in my world. I don't have many of them. I'm a music producer, as they say, and we generally start about noon. So I decided to write this speech and what felt like a bit of a eulogy when I was writing it in the morning to sort of bring the spirit of all of us coming together. So preserving, creating sort of go hand in hand for me. My job is to capture moments and to, deal with the emotional side of stuff and somehow technically bring that together. And, from the time I was, 5, 6 years old, music somehow had some sort of, massive connection with me. And I remember, being in a car going to some event or family function and Sir Duke by Stevie Wonder coming on and immediately having some sort of, visceral effect. And I didn't understand it then. And it took me many years before I was able to sort of tangibly figure it out how that was going to, connect with my life. I'm from Ohio, Midwestern boy that wasn't allowed to play music really because my parents understood my ADD well enough that I was only allowed to have one or two, loves at the time. And so I was a tennis player and went to Eastern Kentucky University and had the good fortune of, marrying a wonderful woman who was a professional tennis player and who's the mother of my children, Susan Sloan. And my tennis racket also not only was my passion at the time, but it was also my guitar. So my sister, who was unfortunately victim to having to sit there and be in the bedroom with me, and we would rock out as the strap of my briefcase or my little backpack or whatever it was I went to school with went across my guitar, and we would sit there and perform music together. And over the years I sort of was guided into a particular narrative of my life where my two passions outside of my family were somehow cohesively crossfaded. So when I left college at Eastern, I went into the tennis world and toured all over the world, and had the great fortune of picking up a lot of world lessons and seeing things and through many different lenses. And when that chapter of my life had reached its conclusion, tennis passion moved in to where my music was able to sort of take step. And some of that was because I wanted to follow that lead, and some of it was out of plain necessity and self-preservation. I'd reached a point in my life where I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I quite frankly didn't have many skill sets outside of doing those two things. So instead of getting a job, I sort of followed my passion and went with it, and threw caution to the wind. And with a wife and 2 kids and a little bit of a reputation around town, I thought I would sort of give it a go, and that's what I did. My parents were, like I think with most of us, they're either sort of an asset or a liability, but both always sort of a drive. And I had the good fortune a couple years ago with the very first band I ever worked with, which is Van Devere, which is an amazing group of people. And I started with Mark Heidinger when he was in a band 3 bands ago in the late 90s when I first recorded, of later on working with a collaboration with Ringo Starr, Beatle. And my mother, I called her up and I said, well, and Mom, if you watch this sometime later on, this is a compliment. This great things happen. I'm finally allowed, because when you work with somebody like that, you sort of keep it under the hood because it may not inevitably happen for you. And said, just got a call. The 2 songs we did with Ringo are coming out. She said, well, that's great, honey. I was like, what? It's good? She's like, yeah, your dad and I were just never big fans, I was like, all right. So back to the drawing board you go, and you stay driven, and that's basically a really good sort of metaphor for the entire, relationship that I have in the music business, because, you're never really allowed to sort of, especially in this modern time, sort of let your guard down and, revel in whatever successes or, moments that you sort of feel proud of. You really got to sort of stay in it. The history of this part of the country is, incredibly rich with music, predominantly roots music, organic, Appalachia, the South, gospel music, soul music, so on and so forth. Quite frankly, very little of that was interest to me when I grew up. I had no relationship with hardly any of those things other than whatever my parents might have played on the jukebox at my house, and whatever English bands that I was into sort of stole from those areas. But I'm very proud to be part of the Kentucky framework musically, and it gave me what inevitably was sort of a happy accident. And that happy accident was working with musicians that found themselves very influenced by this part of the country. And so I took that on as an opportunity to work within the framework technically in those styles. And that was organic music. It was rich in narrative history, great storytelling, and also, combined with a little bit of the way my brain worked was, came from more of a surrealist, place. I was influenced by people like David Lynch, Stanley Kubrick on the film side of stuff, Dan Lanois and Brian Eno in music, and Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko when it came to art. So if I was going to do this, I understood that I was going to have to embrace the geography of the history of music that came out of this part of the country. At the same time, I was really interested in sort of taking a little bit further and doing something more and manipulating that. And I had the very wonderful opportunity to work with Ben Solee, who deserves a round of applause as far as I'm concerned. Cello player, influenced by this part of the country, Appalachian music, and we worked together on a few albums, and one of those albums was Dear Companion, which not only was an album of what I consider really wonderful music and a great collaboration between him and Daniel Martin Moore, who is also very informed by this particular geography, Kentucky in particular, and then Jim James from My Morning Jacket was doing a lot of production on that particular album, and that was a really nice crossfade moment for my production work and sort of the way I looked at things, because we were doing something that was about mountaintop removal and very sort of environmental forward. And artistically, I thought all those people were incredibly gifted, and they gave me sort of free rein to engineer and sort of manipulate and work in a particular way. And one of my favorite moments of my sort of professional existence was in working with Jim, who has a really right-brained, and I consider sort of a musical genius. I adore his work. We were dealing with a very sort of organic arrangement and organic texture, and it called for a mandolin, of which Jim had done some work in between the chapters of this particular album, and he had used some sort of little MIDI keyboard. He was just pecking around on it, I guess, at home, and it was a little out of time, and it was certainly fake, and it sounded good and interesting, and with all intention had been meant to be replaced. And the more we worked on it, the more we realized that, it sounded good and it was sort of working. And there became a discussion about it being somewhat potentially not genuine. And he said, well, does it sound good? And, everyone's sort of looking around, trying to validate one another. And And so he said, yeah, but, it's done on a keyboard. It's a mandolin. Shouldn't we do that? And he's like, well, I don't really care if it was recorded through a tin can. Does it sound good or not? And we all agreed over time that we could never sort of better that moment. And it became very sort of apparent to me that you judge things not through the lens in which the sort of way it was recorded, but how does it sort of emotionally connect to you? And my job being, as I see it, trying to get your emotions onto that medium in which we record on, and then more importantly, out to the listener. Hopefully at some point or another it reaches the listener's ear, which always is another conversation for another speaker. That really is all that matters. So the emotional connection with what I'm doing and what other producers and mixers and people in music are doing is something that is incredibly important to me. And the tools in which I work is often discussed amongst the geeks in my world, which is, do you work in digital? Do you work on tape? Do you work live? Do you work put together? Do you so on and so forth? And I think it sort of has an effect in a lot of you creative people out there, whether you're, painters, web designers, hairstylists, home builders, remodelers, interior decorators, whatever it is. I don't really think that the way in which you work is as important as the result that you get, but the way that you work inevitably does sort of set the process in which you work sets a vibe and sets a sort of a mental state of mind in which enables that to reach a conclusion and for people to embrace working with you and believe in what you're doing. And I think that human interaction, which is unfortunately we're getting further and further away from that because of, not to sound like an old guy, but, we're all looking down, we're all looking at that phone. We're always very curious as to what other people are doing. We're very sort of living through that lens. I think it's we have to be a little bit conscientious about, interacting with one another and collaborating and talking and, having a sense of what somebody else thinks, because I love to collaborate. I'm very uninterested in my own ideas at this point. I've tapped that. I feel like I've refined my skill set. I feel like I'm pretty good at what I'm doing, but I'm not going to further my knowledge and my skills without the help of somebody else. And as many tutorials and as many, things that exist outside that I can go view from afar, I think the most important tool in my professional existence and probably in my own sort of development as a human is the thoughts and feelings and emotions of somebody else. And, going into the room, whether it's with, $200,000 worth of gear in a $5 million room that's acoustically treated, doesn't really have any great affection for me. I'd like to get somewhere where I'm comfortable and I can interact and I can look into the eyes of somebody and you can laugh and cry, share stories that you might not feel welcome to do in a more clinical situation. So as far as the way that, I work, and then I think that a lot of successful people work that I have sort of followed in the footsteps of, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, U2, Bob Dylan, Willie Nelson, the list goes very deep and broad. I think a lot of times those great pieces of work were done because people feel very comfortable in that atmosphere, and that the tools that you use become very transparent and very sort of, more less transparent, more invisible, and that allows people to sort of let their guard down and invites them into sort of giving you the best not only of their skills and their songs or whatever particular medium you're working in, but it allows them to feel like you're part of their family. And then my job at that juncture is to capture that moment. I don't need you to be good all the time. I need you to be good once. And if you're good once, you probably can be great once. And then at that point, hopefully my skills are refined enough to be able to capture that and know what to do with it. All that being said, I love to take those things and manipulate the absolute heck out of it. I'm not an particularly organic guy once you get past the emotional side of stuff. I like to see what people can do with it and how you can sculpt it and shape it and work with it, and it comes out as something a little bit different. So those contrasts and those textures that you work within, I think are really great. You know, if everybody's pretty, is it really that interesting? You know, if everybody's tall, is anybody short, so on and so forth. You know, if it's all sugar, is there any salt? You got to have these contrasts, these different sort of textural things. So that's a big way that, you know, not only my art or my work or, you know, sort of manifestation of the people that I work with comes out, but that's just sort of what I find interesting as a listener and as a viewer and as a human. So Lexington's a challenge for a music producer. You know, a lot of people will ask me, you know, well, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm a music producer. And they're like, you know, what is that? And, you know, I inevitably just always tell people my job is to finish. I just got to finish the gig. You know, somebody comes to me with their thing, whatever it is, it might be 90% of the way done. It might just be a concept or an idea. But I have to finish my work. And Lexington has been an amazing place for me. My parents were always sort of big fish, small pond type of thing, you know, and if you can do that, you can probably succeed in any particular situation. And I do believe that coming from here wasn't overly competitive. I didn't know, I never worked with another music producer until I had already done probably 20 albums on my own. So I was a bit of an idiot, you know, I didn't have any clue how this worked. But coming from outside of this circle, the industry circle, was really important. And I think one of the things about doing art and doing anything in life and enjoying it is naivety. And it's really hard the older you get and the more you do something, the more baskets you shoot and meals you make and songs you write. It's hard to be naive. Inevitably, I think the isolation from other people in the business that I do was very valuable to me. I got to create my own ideas. I wasn't going to the Java Hut and, no offense for those viewing, East Nashville, and listening to 17 other engineers and producers and songwriters talk about the formulas in which the way they work. I didn't have any of that. I'd go to the Green Lantern and have a spirit and talk to a guy that is a builder or is a, you know, electrician. And I actually deemed a lot from that, and it allowed me to get away from things and collect my own ideas and stay somewhat naive and innocent about it. And I, you know, through that and through some early successes I had people coming from all parts of the world and incredibly intelligent, talented people. You know, there's an amazing songwriter named Joe Pug who has a beautiful podcast that I listened to all the time and I worked with on an album, and he and I would have a lot of discussions about Lexington and the wonderful thing about being an artist not from here and coming in and work and being in this amazing city was that he felt very special, that the space that had been created for him, not only in the studio and the places that they were living at when they were here, but the environment in general, he felt like it was just his own place to create. And that's really the reason why I sort of stayed here on a creative front. And, you know, you have children and you have family and you want to nurture those things, and you don't want to make those sacrifices any more than you're already going to have to do. So, you know, my theory with that was always sort of one of being like a magnet. You know, if I'm good enough, you'll be drawn to what is going on. And I didn't want to sort of always have to go to those other industry areas and placate to the needs and desires of that particular situation. And through some luck and a wonderful community, I was able to do that. You know, being in Lexington also presented the peril of what am I going to do when those people aren't coming to me? So there was these creative collaborations with the amazing talent from here. And one of those was with a very good friend of mine, Jennifer Miller, and we did a thing called 10 and 20. And through 10 and 20 comes Matt Duncan, who went on to go to Broadway and work on Hedwig with Stephen Trask, who's an amazing talent from here in town, Justin Craig, and then Sunday Valley came out of that with Sturgill Simpson. So I believe we might have a little blurb of that. Well, there he is, big guy. So, that was one of those things to where there was a period of time and I really didn't know what I was going to do. So creative collaboration and the amazing people here in town, both on a financial end and a creative end, we put our heads together and did that. And I'm super proud that out of that came, a little bit of a shining light on some, good talent. And obviously, you never know when anything that you're working on, what its inevitable end is going to be. More or less sitting in the front row with Beyonce and who other people that, fly their own planes at the Grammys are going to be. And, Stu was able to do that. And ironically, we're here at the Burl where the Burl Sessions pops up. And that was the same thing, there was a little sort of empty spot in the road. And, there's this beautiful, amazing place. And Cannon and Seth and I had worked together in one of their bands early on, and I was able to come in here previous to the place even opening up, and it just was immediately inviting. And so anytime you're confronted with talent and it sort of presents itself to you, my job is a bit of a sort of a receptor of that and try and figure out not only how to maybe potentially help them, but the self-preservation side comes in as well. It's like, how can I sort of be a part of that as well? It's a fortunate thing. Lexington has a lot of it, and I don't think that a lot of people quite understand how much creative talent is in this town. And I'm glad that things like this are going on to be able to shine that light. The reality of it is that I think that music and my place in it is to try to create some sort of healthy footprint for, some sort of legacy. At this juncture, the musical environment, the artistic environment doesn't present itself as necessarily the place that you're going to get rich. And I knew that when I got into it. So I figured the best thing that I could possibly do is leave some form of legacy or body of work that I could look back on and be proud of, and my kids could look at me and know that, whether I left them a mansion or a mobile home, that I had tried really hard and I had put in my best effort, and that I had created a musical family. And I'm very lucky to have that. I've worked with hundreds of artists, and it's like, it goes beyond a connection of just working with somebody for a period of time. It's a very rich and wonderful thing. And I feel, very proud to have watched some of these artists go on and have, careers that feed their families and send their kids to school. And they can also take that philosophy as well and understand that they also are building their own legacy and their own history. And, that those people are my heroes. They entrusted me for a period of time to work with their material, something that was as close to them as anything, their stories, their hurt, their lives, and manipulate the living heck out of it and try to find it a home. And also understand that besides the art side of it, that there was some sort of commercial expectation to what they were doing. And so I'm very happy to have been a part of that. And I'm very happy to be a part of this and this community. And with great love, I thank you all for having me here.
That was great. Thank you. I think we have time for a few questions, a short Q&A. Anybody want to start? Don't be shy. Really?
Any local artists that you haven't worked with yet that you are on your wish list?
Yeah. I don't know who they are yet because, yes, but I'm working, I spent a lot of time high on my horse about not working with local artists. I when I first got into it, I had sort of a weird moment where I went from being sort of a schmo to working with a lot of national stuff. And I became very disinterested about anything that was going around. I had my little place on National Avenue. I hid under the hood. Nobody knew where I was at. I had my friends Justin Craig and Robbie Casenza, and we made a ton of albums, my own little personal wrecking crew. And then I looked up one day and realized how much was going on in Lexington. And I thought, well, maybe I'm being a bit of an idiot and I need to sort of open my eyes up both on a creative level and a financial level and understand that this could be a good conduit. And so I'm always sort of trying to keep my eyes open on what's going on. There's a lot of local young talent. But one part of the question was that is out there that I'm not working with. I am working with a couple that I really love, Abby Hamilton, is she out there? Justin Wells, who's not just a local talent, he's a national level big genius for me. He's from here, but those are two of a few that I'm working on. Lee Carroll, I don't know if anybody knows Lee. I mean, he's not young, but he's amazing and is a constant floodgate of creativity. So one of any of his projects that he's working on at a particular time is always welcoming. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So there's a lot of people who work in something like you do, where they're working with really creative people who have a vision to create something. And you're really creative. You have a vision. You want to create something with their stuff. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So you've been doing this for a while. Can you talk a little bit about navigating that relationship? When you're literally recreating something that someone else created, and you have to make your visions work together.
Yeah. I think you vet each other a bit before you get together. Like, what one another does. I don't tend to go into things blind very often. I try to figure out what it is that they're doing that I could step into and help and maybe take a little bit further. Not always better, but just different, and create some sort of shape to what they're working on, and that they understand what it is that my skill sets are. I think that those two things are really important. I'm not a pushover. You know, I do have an ego where things are concerned. I think you have to do things, but I also feel like that I understand that my role in things is secondary to what their needs are because I'm being brought in to help their vision. So I do a fair amount of listening to what they've done previously and what they're asking of me to do, and see if those two things align with one another, and then hope that there's enough framework, time-wise, financially, back-end support that the vision can be supported. But my job is a facilitator, and I always tell people that the first thing that I have to do is to like somebody, to work with them, because we're going to really sort of, to quote Bob Dylan, you're going to have to swim with the mermaids when you do this. This is not light work. It's very emotionally taxing, which I love. That's not a martyr, design statement. I love it. I love going in and really getting in deep with somebody and working in that particular way. But you can't do that if somebody's guard's up or they're not willing to sort of allow that to happen. So I try to understand my role, but I'm also not somebody that is going to not tell you when there's a quality control to it. Sometimes the first take, the first thought is the best one, and the artist might want to do 100 of them, and sometimes it's just the opposite. I'd be lying if there's not some sort of psychological side to what it is that I do. I'd like to think of it as not manipulation, but
You can probably take one more. Yeah.
You compared Nashville to Lexington and how there's tons of music there, not much here. I think in any size pond, I think there are any artists who struggle to think that they're good enough, that they have what it takes to be creative, they can get out there. If you had a friend who was, you saw talent, but they just don't really think that they have what it takes, how would you say that, even to a group full of tons of different creative people?
well, I think when you're an artist, the only thought that's important is, and this is where the narcissism, selfish side of art is a positive. I think your thought is the most important thought, and your vision is the most important vision. And having come from the commercial side, when I worked in score and that element, my fail rate was so staggeringly high, because I would always try and chase something somebody else wanted. And instead of like taking a broad stroking comment and then really, follow my own vision with it. And when I became a collaborator and a producer, I started to understand that people like, once again, like Mark Heidinger from Vanderveer, Ben Soley, Jim James, Sturgill Simpson, Joe Pug, Justin Ringel from Horse Feathers, these guys are like, they are not easily deterred. They know what they want. They may not always know how to get there, but they really have a strong vision. And I was really empowered by these type of people. And so it made me very stubborn. And I think that, the best thing that you can do is believe in what it is that you're doing, follow it through, and then allow that belief to be exposed to the world as you present that idea, that finished product to somebody. Then there's no, the difference between somewhere like here for me, and it's not even a geographical thing. It's sort of an idea of artistic naivety and belief, though, is that at some point or another, it does end up on a desk, and you end up in front of that person. And that's always the sort of judge of me as a mixer. I always think about this a lot, is like, at some point, I'm going to be sitting there in front of some record guy, and I'm going to have to present this material. I don't want to apologize for this anyway. The only way that I can allow myself to not apologize is to 100% believe in the choices that I made. If I questioned anything along the way and I compromised to such a degree that I wasn't comfortable, then I'm likely to cave in that moment. And the artists that I've worked with who've been really super, successful and very happy, more importantly, have followed that, stuck to their guns, been diligent, and then inevitably, when those answers and those relationships on the back end come, I think they hold those people on the business side just as accountable as that they were on the creative side, and that they held me on being the conduit to that. How to get all that business stuff going and all those particular things is, that's a whole other discussion. But, I do think that if you're not willing to stand behind what you're doing, you really are sort of, out in the middle of the ocean floating around, waiting to be sort of overturned and swallowed up. So I think you have to be very selfish and very, very strong with what you're doing. And that comes from some of the most, ethereal, cerebral people I've ever worked with, who aren't part of the framework of this 2019 power set mess that we sort of have going on. That bravado isn't necessary in such an external way. It's just a belief in what you're doing. And I do think people are drawn to that. When you believe in something, I do think that a lot of people are pulled to that magnetic theory. They come to you, and it's, it doesn't have to be verbose or, sitting next to Kanye West to do that. It just, you can do it in a very sort of personal manner.